On the 21st of November, a bone-chilling incident happened in Detroit. An innocent-looking teenager broke into the house of a senior citizen and beat him to a stupor before setting him ablaze. There are a lot of incredibly painful parts to the story, but what made it even more annoyingly absurd was the fact that the suspect was seen giving a statement on local TV like he was a concerned neighbor who was truly sorry for the misfortune that had befallen the old man. What business could a teenager and a man almost 5 times his age have had together to lead to such a tragic situation? Paul Monchnik was a 91-year-old man who lived alone in Detroit. He was a good man who was friendly with almost everyone in the neighborhood. People often look out for him and call the police to ward off trespassers on his property or troublemakers who might just want to take advantage of his old age and senility. Paul may have been a frail old-timer when the incident happened, but he wasn't always like that. He was once in the Army where he served his time. Retired as a war hero before working as a television repairman. He worked diligently until he couldn't continue due to old age. Although old, the 91-year-old man was still an ardent reader of the newspaper. He loved to be up to date with the news and happenings around him. But sadly that came to an abrupt end on the 21st of November 2015 when a trouble-minded teenager snuck up on him. Around 2:50 a.m., the boy, from the investigation that was carried out, smashed the man's face in, hit him in different places, and knocked him unconscious. After he was done, he didn't leave the man alone to be found by good neighbors who could take him to the hospital. Instead, he drenched him with petrol before lighting him up. Once the house was on fire, he snatched the keys to the old man's car, a 2000 Chevrolet van, and drove it away. It was now clear that the whole catastrophe was about robbing the man and concealing evidence. He could have just taken the car and left the old man, but then he must have taken into account that his target was a war veteran and that trying to rob him might not be a walk in the park. The neighbors called the police when they saw that Paul's house was on fire, and in minutes the scene was swarming with police, firefighters, and paramedics. They opened the door to the house that was now filled with thick, dark smoke in search for the fire victim. Paul Monchnik was found lying on his back near the door. By the time they got to him, his body had become badly burnt, and due to his age, he had long died. The poor old man suffered from the 1st to 4th degree of 80% of his body. At this time, his family had arrived, and seeing their father in that horrible state broke their hearts into pieces. One of the deceased's son, Scott Monchnik, was especially frantic, and amidst wild sobs, he begged the neighbors to help find his dad's attacker. Now the big question on everyone's lips was who could have started the fire and how to find them. The Detroit police officers set to work and were determined to leave no stone unturned until the culprit was found and incarcerated. The first stroke of luck was getting their hands on video footage at a gas station. In the video, someone who drove Paul's van had stopped at the gas station to buy some fuel and a lighter. His entire face wasn't captured on CCTV, but the side of his face that was clear was enough to attach a wanted sign for the public's easy identification. Now, it's getting interesting and weird at the same time. Would you believe that the face captured on CCTV belonged to one of Paul's neighbor's grandson, a teenager called George Steward IV? The police called George Steward II to inform them of what they thought their grandson had done. It was unbelievably shocking because the same boy had granted an interview the previous day when some news channels were covering the tragic incident. When George Steward IV was talking, he looked shaken, just the right emotion to display when a close neighbor had just died. He said Paul didn't deserve to go the way he did. Now, the same person who appeared on the news talking all nice about the deceased was the one found on camera and likely to have perpetrated the heinous crime. His family was at first confused because the psyche of the cold-hearted killer was miles different from the kid they knew, or at least the one they thought they knew. George Steward IV, the 17-year-old suspect, had only recently moved to Detroit from Romulus, where he attended high school. His mother was trying to move to Detroit, so she had asked his grandfather, George Steward II, to look after him while she sorted out some stuff about logistics. According to the suspect's family, George was a good kid. He attended church regularly and never got in trouble. He played basketball and soccer and was the dream child of many American homes because he could go on to become successful in sports. No one had any reason to think he was capable of such a sinister act, and one could hardly blame them. He was an easygoing kid who never made any slip-up to necessitate any close attention or monitoring. When the police visited the house with a search warrant, they turned the place upside down and they were able to get their hands on some damning evidence. First, they saw the key to Paul's car, even though the said car was nowhere to be found. Also, they were able to locate the can with which he purchased the fuel he used in setting Paul ablaze. George was arrested and his bewildered family agreed to follow him to the police station while strongly hoping that the whole thing was a mistake or a nightmare that would soon be over. At the station, after several rounds of questioning coupled with the evidence found at George's house, they were able to establish that the teenager was indeed responsible for the terrible crime. When his grandfather was asked what he thought about the tragic and quite worrisome issue, he said he was immensely sorry for the Monchnik family, but George was still his grandson and that he loved him unconditionally. He said he could only hope that no family ever had to experience the tragedy his family was going through. And for the rest of the family, especially George's sister, George Steward, they had a hard time believing that George had it in him to commit such a crime. But then it was possible that he had always been like that and that he was just good at hiding it. Also, sometimes it's hard for people to see the monster in the people they love. In December 2015, a preliminary hearing was set up to determine if the police had enough evidence to nail him and proceed the main hearing, where he would likely be locked away forever. At the preliminary hearing, one of the bodies that testified to the case was the Detroit Fire Department investigator. When asked what state they met Paul's body, he answered that he suffered a deep wound that looked like a gunshot to the head, an open wound on his right arm which was likely caused by a blunt trauma, and an indentation to the torso. A medical examiner also had some horrific accounts to give when he took to the stand. He said the old man suffered 1st to 4th degree burns on about 80% of his body. In addition, he also said the man inhaled too much smoke and his weak lungs had collapsed before any real help could get to him. After the testimony, the people who identified George were asked to take the stand. The people who identified him were 2 of his aunts, a Romulus police officer at George's former school, and finally, the attendant who sold fuel to George a day before the incident. At some point, the courtroom became heated when George's lawyer tried to discredit the testimony of his aunts. She was certain that his aunts could not have easily recognized him because they had not seen him for a long time. Furthermore, his aunts could be mistaken since it was only part of his face that was visible and captured by the CCTV. In response, the first aunt said that while it was true that she had not laid her eyes on George in a couple of months, she could make out his distinct feature because she raised his sister and they shared the same features. The second aunt displayed a higher level of certainty. She said she had seen George in the summer of the same year, so there was no way she wouldn't recognize him. The Romulus police officer from the school George used to attend before traveling to Detroit was also one of the people who placed a call to the police to identify the person in the picture. He said George was far too popular a face not to be easily identified. This was because he played basketball and soccer. The last person who identified George was the attendant at the gas station, where he procured fuel and a lighter. The man said he noticed that George was nervous while he was at the gas station, but he had no way of knowing what his customer had up his sleeves. After all these people had spoken, it was time to call up the family of Paul Monchnik to talk about the death of their departed loved one. Scott Monchnik, the son of the deceased, gave a chilling testimony that drove the audience to tears. He said he received a call around 3 a.m. on the 21st of November from a concerned neighbor that the house his dad had lived in for 65 years was burning. By the time he got there, he was beside himself with sadness as the whole house had become blackened and the remains of his loving father were almost unrecognizably charred. After all the testimony and evidence had been carefully examined, George was charged with felony assault and first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 to 60 years with no possibility of parole in sight. While some of George's family were still in denial that their little brother had indeed perpetuated such an egregious crime and was going to spend the most productive part of his life in seclusion, the family of Paul Monchnik was happy that their father got justice. They said it would have been impossible to live with themselves if their father's abuser and killer walked free. They were aware that George's imprisonment would not bring their father back, but it would at least soothe their grieving hearts that he was receiving adequate punishment. What do you think of George's case? Do you think he got a strong enough sentence, given that a life was lost? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below.